welcome to this talk about how virtual reality and AR can be used to treat mental health disorders. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Niclas Wijkström. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Mimerse. I have a background in finance, but left that sector a couple of years ago and got in contact with my co-founder, William Hamilton, who studied clinical psychology at Stockholm University and performed and started Mimerse as a research project together with a research group there. I'm going to come back to that about what application that was. But basically, Mimerse is developing evidence-based mental health treatments using primarily virtual reality at the moment. So this is the agenda for today. Going to go through the mental health treatment gap, so the issues globally with mental health, why use virtual reality for mental health treatment, a bit research background, consumer grade VR, so basically the second wave of VR that started a couple of years ago. Some use cases, some of our applications, what you can improve for the future. And then after 15 minutes, I'm going to start the Q&A. So if you have any questions, just feel free to write them in the chat box here to the right, and I'll make sure to try to answer them. So the mental health treatment gap, it's basically at least 25% of everybody on this planet will at least once during their lifetime experience some type of mental health disorder, be it mild stress to things more severe like schizophrenia and eating disorder. On the other hand, in the top right corner in the presentation, you can see that of everybody working in healthcare is about 1% that are educated mental health professionals. So you have a gigantic mismatch between supply and demand here. And that obviously leads to a lot of suffering. More than 2/3 of people who seek treatment globally never receive any treatment. But then also, according to WHO, about 1 trillion euros is lost every year due to loss of economic output. So basically people being home from work or being less effective at work. Obviously, VR is not going to help solve this problem on its own, but hopefully it will be a part of it. So not to delve down too much on the philosophy here, but what is reality to human? We are basically inference machines. So we have different senses, and then our brain kind of creates a model of the reality, which is not always the best model. And what virtual reality can do is basically to take the two largest senses, in this case, sight and vision, and manipulate the brain, and that allows for real emotions and anxiety, for example, to be triggered. So even though you have a headset on, you know that it's not real. The kind of reactive parts of your brain doesn't, which means that you can, a good example is you're on the top of a building in VR. It's impossible not to feel vertigo. And some of these most powerful changes you can get is that you present the person to distressful situation and kind of learn from it. And that's basically exposure therapy, but I'll get into that. Using VR for mental health is not new at all, actually. Research started in the early mid-90s to early 2000s. These headsets were incredibly big, bulky. They were very expensive. They could easily cost 100,000 euros, and you basically had to have an entire room for it. You got motion sick quite quickly because basically the latency in the screens and all the sensors were quite bad. So if you turn your head, it was a lag before the image turned, which means that you feel sick quite instantly. But despite these limitations, researchers were able to create application for different types of mental health disorders. As an example, you can see here phobias, pain distraction, PTSD. PTSD is an example, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some parts of the therapy is about something called imaginary exposure. So basically the therapist tells you to close your eyes and imagine yourself being in that situation. And that might be difficult for people. About 10 to 15% can't get mental images. So that's why VR is good. You can create these scenarios and then you can kind of work through that in therapy. So in the US, for example, healthcare providers use this for returning soldiers, for example. And pain distraction is one of the most researched areas. Hunter Hoffman could show that just using simple application to distract the patient from acute pain could be more efficient than using morphine. So basically, even though the technology was very crude, they could prove that it works. And along came consumer-grade VR. So it started with a Kickstarter, Oculus, Kickstarted in 2012 to make these headsets better and cheaper and more ergonomic. Improvements in screen technology and sensors meant that you have less motion sickness, even though some people might still experience it. The research has continued with these new headsets, and not being as big and bulky and expensive means that you can go from a lab environment to actually test it in a clinical setting. And that's something that we're doing as well. And as you can see, research publication containing the word virtual reality has increased quite a bit since the 90s, and has increased, even though this is from 2014, even more since. Another development, as you see at the bottom right-hand corner, is that these headsets are now standalone, which means that they're mobile. Everything, all the processor and everything is within the headset, so you don't have to have an expensive gaming rig in order to power these applications. And that's obviously very good for us if you're in a hospital setting, to be able to come with just a smaller headset instead of a large computer. So these are some of the areas where research has been shown to be efficient. Applications in these areas, the one that are pink in this case are applications that we either have done research tests or have applications that we're selling now. So I'm just going to go into briefly explain some use cases, in this case our application. So as I mentioned, it started as a research project. This was the world's first automated VR cognitive behavioral therapy treatment that was tested in a clinical trial. Basically, what automatic means is that the patient put on a headset, and we have created this CBT game, basically with game progression, that you go through these exercises. And you can do a lot of things in VR, which you can't in real life. As an example, the spiders, the actual stimuli, it's better to start exposure therapy gradually. So the first spider was this Disney Pixar spider with American helmet and shoes on its feet. And as the levels progressed, it got more and more spider-like. And we performed a randomized controlled trial with 100 participants. So basically 50 people got a therapist and real spiders, and then 50 just walked into a room with a VR headset and played through this application. And we have since published paper on that, basically proving that it's as efficient as traditional therapy. And although VR is very early in its infancy, that kind of enables that you can actually have clinically validated application that a consumer can download without the need of a therapist. So it has, scaling potential. The other application that we created is called Complace. So most of you probably know about the application Headspace. So it's these different types of mindfulness applications. It's basically like that, but on steroids. We have, mindfulness exercises, deep breathing, muscle relaxation, which are all tools that psychologists use today to decrease stress and anxiety. But then with the added benefit of performing these exercises through guidance in different virtual environments. And why we use that is because there's a lot of research that has shown that if a person spends 10 to 15 minutes in nature environment, you actually decrease your pulse and blood pressure, which is good if you want to reduce stress and anxiety. We have tested this in a small pilot study. We have a very large ongoing with 100 participants at Sahlgrenska University, which is a psychiatric ward. And it can be used quite a large different use cases. So hospital, for example, we have done tests before operations. So instead of giving patients medication, they get the headset, they're completely locked out of the real world and just focusing on their breathing to decrease their stress levels. Also after operations, which can be stressful as well. We have psychologists that use this in their clinics to decrease stress. And we have also done tests at a school to give to students. And Students really love it, and you know, with some people who perform better on tests just because they used virtual reality relaxation before tests to kind of like get those levels down. The third use case is our application called Speaking Place, which is an application to reduce fear of public speaking. It's based upon the same kind of theory as phobia treatment, so exposure therapy. So, you know, you're not used to be on a stage, which means that your anxiety levels go up. You know, you shake and you get sweaty, which means that you have avoidance behavior. So the next time you get this physiological response, so you turn down an opportunity to speak in front of people, for example. So we created the same environment here. So basically you have 27 different CBT exercises, kind of this progression board as you go along. With that, you have increasing difficulty environments as well. So the first environment is a conference room with 5 people. You do a couple of exercises there. Then you go to a boardroom, classroom, auditorium, theater, and then we have the Globe Arena here in Stockholm with thousands of people. So you actually, you know, exercise with live audiences. And we've done studies before we created this application to kind of prove that even though we're using mobile VR headsets, which has the same graphical, you know, capability as your smartphone, if you do an application or create an application that's immersive enough, so you kind of fool these reactive parts of the brain that I spoke about, then it's enough to trigger these physiological responses and anxiety levels, which means that you can do these exercises whenever you want at home or at a psychologist, but you can do it at your own pace and over again. And that's what you need to do in order to get rid of speech anxiety. So I actually published a paper. We did a study together with PBM, published a paper this week, which basically proves that it's an efficient tool to use to decrease anxiety that's common with fear of public speaking. And in this case, you know, an obvious customer for us is psychologists, but also like large corporations. So we've added a function where you have presentation skills instead of CBT exercises. So like if I have a presentation in front of 500 people, I can just upload a PDF on my headset, select auditorium, and then behind me in the virtual world, I have my presentation. I can do like a 15-minute speech, and then I press replay, and then all of a sudden I'm in the perspective of the audience, and then I can, you know, see and watch myself, listen to myself perform, and kind of like base real-time feedback on that. So we have even very experienced speakers who think that this is a very good and new way to prepare for presentations. So just briefly on the future, what can be improved? Obviously, I usually say that virtual reality today is like the personal computer was in the mid to late 80s. Some people have tried it, less people have it at home, but people who have tried it, they understand that this might change a lot of things, and that's the same thing with virtual reality. So what we obviously need to improve is the hardware, have a smaller form factor so you can have the headset for longer periods of time. You can see on the right-hand side, you have 2 concepts from HTC and Oculus, which is way smaller than the ones that they sell today. Stuff like varifocal lenses. So varifocal lenses is basically mimicking your focus system that the eye has. If you put on a headset today, you have a fixed mid-range focus, which means that after 1-2 hours of usage, you can get eye fatigue, for example. Eye tracking as well. Some headsets have it now, and basically that means that we know where the user is looking in the application, which is good for obvious reasons. Larger field of view. Today, these headsets are limited to about 110 degrees. That needs to go to 180 degrees, but then also vertical field of view to make it even more immersive. And more immersive basically means that in our field of VR therapy, it's more efficient. Rendering AI, for example, there's a lot of processing going on, 60 to 100 times per second on 2 screens. We need to have AI to make this more, computational efficient. Biometric feedback, we're actually doing a test today with a company who has one of these facial insets. When you put on the headset, they actually have a biometric sensor. So they have a model where they can sense your state of emotion. And that's also good for us in our application, that we can know the level of anxiety that the user has, and that you can change the application based upon how the patient or user is feeling. Clinical usage, we're doing testing in hospital. We need to have protocols for that and best practices, and that takes a lot of time and needs to be shared amongst the industry. It has to go even more from just being cool tech to actually being a useful tool. And I think for the past 2 years in enterprise virtual reality, that has started to happen. So, a couple of years ago, people were just doing, cool tests, pilot tests, basically. And now you have, large industrial companies doing simulations. You have basically all the large car manufacturers using virtual reality in the design process. Also doing more automatic treatments, because you can do these cool exposure applications for psychologists, but that doesn't really help the mental health treatment gap that I said in the beginning. So when consumer VR gets bigger, you need to have these automatic treatments so people can, treat themselves in the comfort of their own home. When you're working with these types of applications, you obviously need FDA and CE certification, and that has started now, but that's something that's incredibly expensive. It takes a lot of time, but it will be needed for this vertical in VR to flourish. And then augmented reality. So basically everything I've said in this presentation goes for augmented reality as well. And my definition of augmented reality is not having a phone, it's just having a form factor like this with large field of view. And I think that's about 5 to 7 years out. But some of these applications might be better to use for augmented reality. So that's is really exciting development on those AR glasses as well. So that was that. Went over the time a little bit. So if you have any questions, you can just add them in the chat box here. We have a question from Hannah. Considering the fact that this is sensory tech treatment, and as we know, tech issues are frequent, is a risk that in treatment tech issues can be detrimental to certain patients with certain conditions? Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, in our experience, that's not an issue at all. If something bugs out and you get like a black screen, that's not really debilitating for a patient. What would be, for example, is that if you have a spider treatment and then all of a sudden like a large spider just flies in front of your face, and that's never going to happen. So there's no issue with that. And then also, with all of these risk considerations, you can always take off your headset. As opposed to if you're in treatment where you have a psychologist and you have a spider, you can't really go out of the room when you're doing therapy. So you could argue that using virtual reality for phobias, for example, is actually more secure for patients. Marcus, great listening to you. Hook up in Spatial. Yeah, sure. Spatial is an kind of conference app that was launched today, so absolutely. How about the risk of addiction? That's also a good question. I mean, you could compare that to the addiction of computer games. So you always have addiction possibilities for whatever a person is engaging in. If you compare it to gaming, it's a lot less at the moment. The risk is less because you can sit at your PlayStation and play a game for easily 5 hours and forget that you need to eat. If you put on a headset and play like a game shooting zombies, after about 20 to 30 minutes, you're completely drained because it's actually as you are in that world, which means that your brain, you have to do it in like 30-minute chunks because it's really intense, which means that the addiction problem isn't as big if you compare to gaming, for example. What about the interaction with digital environment? Do you see any device that could substitute controllers? Leap Motion, for example. Yeah, so Leap Motion, definitely. But Oculus Quest, for example, which has this new headset, they have cameras on the front where it actually maps your hands quite good. And I think that's the way to go forward. But in some games, you need controllers. But for our our purpose, for example, having finger tracked real time is way better. I'm not sure if we have more time here, but I'll answer some questions before a moderator jumps in. I heard you're working on your application to help furry dogs. Is that so? Do you think it'll take to develop? Yeah, so we actually started, it's on pause now, but we started to do just a prototype for a professor at Stockholm University to try this kind of neural network to mimic the movement of dogs. So we're working on that. I think it probably won't happen before we get more funding. But if we got funding and developed it, it takes everything between 4 to 12 months. It just depends on, the level of difficulty in development. Do you see this spreading further than exposure therapy? I'm just curious how you would imagine expanding into different addiction. Yes, addiction, for example, you have something called Q exposure, even though that's not recommended here in Sweden, is that, if you have heroin addict, for example, you create a virtual scenario where you're in this, environment where you have a lot of like needles and people being sick, and you use that for therapy. And then for addiction, we have a planned study as well to get rid of cravings. So instead of having cravings, you have an application of virtual reality, which is kind of distracting, to decrease craving amongst, in this case, cannabis addiction. You can do a lot of things. So the fun thing with virtual reality is just, the imagination sets its limits. We are discussing with UCLA to do an application to combat depression, or actually anhedonia, which is a part of depression. So it's the, if you played a lot of tennis and you love playing tennis, if you have depression, all of a sudden playing tennis is not fun anymore. So doing an application to kind of promote positive thinking, that's something you can do in virtual reality as well. So the imagination is the limit. How user experience design can help on this process? That's incredibly important. A lot of research has been done with that, and Oculus, or these hardware manufacturers, are doing that as well. The area is still incredibly new, so it's basically like you have a clean slate on how you're going to develop things. And I've seen some, in UX, for example, some companies have sold a successful game, and then all of a sudden everybody's copying that type of interaction and experience design, and I don't think that's the way to go. It's still a kind of clean slate, so it's very important, and the way forward is just doing a lot of testing, basically. Cool. I've run out over 2 minutes, but thanks for the questions. You can see my email address here, Niclas@mimerse.com, or search for LinkedIn. So if you have any more questions or want to have a chat, just let me know. So thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.